Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've always preferred camping alone. There's a sense of freedom in it, being completely on your own, surrounded by nothing but the quiet of the forest. People never really understood why I did it, but they didn't have to. The solitude, the isolation, the simplicity of it all, those were my reasons. I had planned this particular trip for months, a solo hike through the dense wilderness of the Adirondacks. It was a 3-day trek to an isolated spot, far from any established campgrounds or trails. That's what made it appealing. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked along the ridges, my only companions the birds and the wind through the trees. By the time I reached the valley where I planned to set up camp, I was exhausted but content. The clearing was perfect, nestled between 2 hills with a small stream running nearby. No signs of anyone having been here for a long time. Exactly what I wanted. I pitched my tent as the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the pines. The air was crisp, the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. I set up a small fire and settled in, watching the stars blink to life above me. For the first few hours, it was peaceful, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, making the world feel distant. I leaned back, staring up at the night sky, the crackling of the fire the only sound. That's when I heard it. A rustle in the trees just outside the ring of firelight. I sat up, my senses sharpening. It was probably an animal, I told myself. This deep in the woods, it could be anything. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. But the rustling didn't stop. It moved slowly, circling the camp just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trunks of trees and the tangled underbrush. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was nothing. The forest is full of sounds at night, and my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, there was an unease that I couldn't shake. I added more wood to the fire, letting the flames grow higher, and sat closer to the warmth. A few hours passed, and I started to relax again. The fire was burning low, and I was just about to call it a night when I heard it again. This time it wasn't just a rustle, it was a voice. Faint, barely audible over the sound of the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A single word, whispered from the darkness. Help. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, scanning the trees with the flashlight, but again there was nothing. Just the dark outline of the woods. I sat there listening, straining to hear anything else, but the voice was gone. It had to be my imagination. There was no way anyone was out here this far off the trail. I hadn't seen another person in 2 days, and I was miles from any populated area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to push the thought from my mind and settled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every small sound in the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. I didn't know what had woken me at first, until I heard it again. The voice. Help. This time it was closer, clearer. A man's voice, hoarse and desperate, calling from just outside my tent. I shot up, fumbling for my flashlight, my heart racing. I unzipped the tent and shined the light into the darkness, but there was nothing, no one, just the trees, silent and still. I called out, my voice shaky. Hello? Is someone out there? No response, just the deafening quiet of the forest. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the knife I always kept with me. I scanned the perimeter of my camp, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the trees. Help me. The voice was right behind me now, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. My flashlight beam swung wildly through the trees, searching, but finding nothing. Panic set in. I backed toward the fire, my knife raised, the light darting from tree to tree. The voice kept calling, circling around me, always just out of sight. Help me. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, as if there were a dozen voices now, all whispering the same plea. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The voice didn't stop. It followed me, growing closer, more desperate with every second. By the time I was ready to leave, I could barely think straight. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out. I grabbed my pack, snuffed out the fire, and started running, flashlight bobbing in the darkness, the voice still echoing behind me. I ran through the woods for what felt like hours, tripping over roots and rocks, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I was miles from the campsite, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Only then did the voice finally stop. I made it back to the trailhead by noon, exhausted, filthy, and shaken to my core. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? But I can still hear it sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed. That voice, whispering from the darkness. Help me. I took the ranger job in the vast, dense woods of Blackstone Forest for solitude. The days were quiet, mostly, patrolling trails, checking campgrounds, and the occasional warning to hikers who wandered too far off the beaten path. But when the sun dipped below the jagged tree line, a different world seemed to awaken. I'd heard stories, locals whispering about strange shapes that slinked between the trees and sounds that didn't belong to any animal they knew. I'd always brush them off. At least I did until that night. It was a late autumn evening and a biting wind howled through the forest as I started my shift. I'd been asked to check on a campsite deep within the woods, where campers had reported strange noises the previous night. They said something large had been pacing around their tent, growling, a low, guttural rumble that didn't sound like any animal they could identify. The campers had packed up and left at dawn, refusing to spend another night out there. But someone had to go investigate, and it fell to me. The hike was long and tedious, with an eerie silence pressing in the further I went. The air felt thick, as if the trees themselves were watching. As I neared the campsite, a peculiar odor reached me, something metallic and rotting. I almost turned back, but the sense of duty kept me moving. When I arrived, the campsite was exactly as they'd described. 2 tents, a fire pit with half-burned logs, and a mess of scattered belongings. It was as if they had left in a hurry. As I circled the site, I noticed something odd. Large clawed footprints were imprinted in the mud, leading from the edge of the camp into the dense woods. They were too big to belong to any bear, and the spacing was unnatural, almost as if whatever had made them was walking upright. I followed the tracks with a flashlight, each step feeling heavier than the last. The further I went, the more twisted and gnarled the trees became, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A low rustling filled the air, and I froze. Ahead, something moved, something large, hunched and covered in matted fur. It had the face of a dog, but the body of a man, with limbs that seemed too long, joints bending in unnatural ways. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The creature stared at me, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Then it let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but more of a distorted mimicry of a human scream. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, and then the thing turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving with an unnatural, bone-snapping speed. I should have run back to the station. I should have left right then and there, but something compelled me to keep going. It was like I was being drawn deeper, as if the forest itself wanted me to see more. The tracks were joined by others now, long slithering trails that suggested something massive and serpent-like had passed through. alongside prints that looked eerily human, but too large and too misshapen. As I continued, the noises around me grew louder, strange whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the snapping of branches far too close, and that same metallic smell growing stronger. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just one creature stalking me. It was many. Finally, I came upon a clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center stood a circle of crudely made totems, carved from twisted branches and bones. Each totem had a face, some animalistic, others almost human, but all bearing that same disturbing, hollow-eyed gaze. And at the base of each totem were piles of offerings, old clothes, personal belongings, photographs that looked faded and worn, as if they'd been left there for years. Among them, I noticed a nameplate from a ranger uniform, cracked and barely legible. I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I knew that name. He was a ranger who had gone missing 5 years ago, one of the many mysterious disappearances that the station hushed up with half-hearted explanations and paperwork. I glanced at the other objects and recognized more pieces, things that belonged to the other campers who had vanished over the years. Then, just as my mind began to piece together the horrific truth, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Why are you here?" it asked, but it was my own voice. I spun around only to see myself standing there, a perfect mirror image. But there was something wrong with it. My face was twisted, eyes empty and soulless. It smiled, revealing rows of unnaturally sharp teeth. Panic surged through me as I backed away, stumbling over roots and rocks. The other creatures emerged from the trees, their forms shifting, some half-human, others with features that defied all logic. They encircled me, and I could feel their hunger, their eyes boring into my soul. My doppelganger stepped closer, reaching out with a hand that seemed to melt and reform with every step. "You're one of us now," it whispered, and I could feel a dark, invasive presence burrowing into my mind, twisting my thoughts, distorting my sense of reality. I don't remember how I made it back to the station. I just remember the sunrise breaking over the tree line as I stumbled through the door, covered in mud and blood. They found me rambling, clutching at my head, muttering about totems and shadows. They say I was hallucinating, that I spent the night out there lost and alone. But I know what I saw. And now, when I look in the mirror, I don't always recognize the face staring back at me. Every night since then I hear it, the whispering from the woods, calling me back, luring me into the darkness. And some nights when the forest is quiet, I swear I can see shadows at the edge of the trees, watching and waiting for me to return. Because I know the truth now, once you enter Blackstone Forest, a part of you never really leaves. The forest waits, it remembers, and it claims those who dare to uncover its secrets. I love camping. The isolation, the quiet, the feeling of disconnecting from the world for a while. It's peaceful. At least it used to be. I had planned this trip for weeks, meticulously picking out a remote spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was far from the main hiking trails, well off the beaten path. No other campers for miles. Just me, my tent, and the sounds of nature. That's how I liked it. I got there in the early afternoon, found a clearing, and set up camp. The sun filtered through the trees in that golden way it does before dusk, and the forest was alive with birds and rustling leaves. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and leaned back against a log, sipping on a cheap beer I'd brought along. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the woods started to change. It was gradual at first. The birds went quiet, and the rustling in the underbrush stopped. Nothing unusual, just the forest settling into its nighttime rhythm, I figured. But the silence felt different. Heavier. I ignored it and fed the fire, watching the flames dance as the last sliver of daylight disappeared. I had a small lantern with me, but I preferred the light of the fire. It was warmer, more natural. I had just finished cooking a simple dinner when I heard it. A crunch. A heavy footstep on dry leaves coming from the tree line behind me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I listened carefully, but heard nothing else. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. The woods are full of them. I went back to eating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then a whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A low, soft whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I turned quickly, scanning the dark woods behind me with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the thick shadows cast by the trees. I called out, but my voice sounded small in the dense silence. "Hello? Anyone there?" No answer. Just more silence. I convinced myself it was the wind, though there wasn't any, and settled back down. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. This was no different. But then it happened again. A whisper, this time clearer, closer. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the woods around me. The beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No animals, no people, nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, floating in and out like a distant conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I could barely make out the words, but they didn't sound like English. They sounded wrong, twisted. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I slowly circled the campfire, shining the light into the shadows, feeling like at any moment something would jump out at me. But all I saw were trees, endless and unmoving. I was alone, or at least I should have been. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the whispering, it didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, more insistent, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. Then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, standing perfectly still, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I focused, I realized something was wrong. The proportions were off. Its limbs were too long, the body too thin, and its head, God, its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was broken. I couldn't see its face, it was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground like something had a hold of me. But then the figure twitched, a quick, unnatural jerk, and I snapped out of it. I grabbed my knife and backed toward my tent, heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, like dozens of voices all speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it felt malicious. I fumbled with the zipper of my tent, my hand shaking, all the while keeping my eyes on the figure. It hadn't moved. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Just like that. I blinked, shining the flashlight in the spot where it had been. But there was nothing. No footprints. No disturbed leaves. Nothing. But the whispers, they were still there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for dawn. Every so often I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle. But I didn't dare look. I just stayed there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the incessant, eerie murmur of the voices just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. When the first light of day finally broke through the trees, I packed up and left without hesitation. I didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just needed to get out. I practically ran back to my car, the entire time feeling like something was following me, just out of sight. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. I made it back home by midday, exhausted and shaken, but relieved to be away from those woods. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I had just imagined it. But last night, lying in bed, I heard it again. The whispering, faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside my window. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear them. Those voices, whispering, waiting. I remember the first time I set foot in Blackwater Pines. I'd been a park ranger for years by then, stationed at various national parks across the country. But Blackwater was different. The forest had a strange, almost oppressive energy. like the trees were watching, waiting for something. The locals had their superstitions, stories of strange creatures, unnatural sounds, people going missing without a trace. But I'd always been skeptical. That changed one cold, foggy night in October. I was assigned to patrol the far side of the park, where a group of campers had reported strange noises near their site. They'd claimed to hear someone, or something, whispering outside their tent. They didn't see anything, but they swore they could feel eyes on them pressing in through the fog. The sun was already setting when I started my hike, casting long claw-like shadows across the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in as I went deeper, their twisted branches reaching out like bony fingers. The temperature dropped with every step, and soon enough I could see my breath clouding in front of me. Blackwater pines had a way of swallowing sound too. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots and the distant call of a lone owl. After about an hour, I reached the campsite. It was empty, save for a smoldering fire pit and a couple of chairs left abandoned. The campers must have packed up and left in a hurry. I radioed back to the station, letting them know I was going to scout the area to make sure there was no wildlife threat. Bears, maybe, or coyotes. That's what I told myself anyway. But as I circled the campsite, I found tracks. Long, deep prints that didn't look like any animal I knew of. They were like elongated footprints with claws at the tips, sinking into the soft earth as if something heavy had passed through. I bent down to get a closer look, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoing from somewhere deeper in the woods. My blood went cold. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my flashlight. But there was nothing there. Just the fog, swirling thick and soupy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a tree root when I heard a voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but I could make out the words, "Help me." The voice was close, too close, like it was right behind me. I whipped around, flashlight darting between the trees, but there was no one there. I stood there, heart hammering, the beam of my light cutting through the fog in desperate, jerky movements. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I saw it. At the edge of my flashlight's reach, just beyond the trees, stood a figure. It looked almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale, stretched taut over its bones. It had no face, just a smooth, blank surface where features should have been. But I could feel it watching me, those empty eye sockets boring into my soul. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the thing. It didn't move, just stood there, tilting its head as if it was curious, almost amused. And then it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. My heart stopped as I realized it wasn't alone. All around me, figures began to materialize out of the fog. Their faceless heads turned in my direction, their bodies shifting and contorting as they moved closer. I turned and ran. I didn't care about staying quiet or avoiding roots and rocks. I just ran, tearing through the underbrush, my flashlight swinging wildly. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes as I stumbled blindly through the darkness. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps soft but relentless, getting closer with every second. I burst into a clearing and stopped dead. There in the center was a massive stone altar, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow in the moonlight. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was ancient, worn down by centuries of weather and time. But the thing that really caught my attention was what lay on top of it. A human body, or what was left of one. It was dressed in ranger gear, and it took me a second to recognize the face. My face. I staggered back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It was like looking into a twisted mirror, seeing myself lying there, lifeless and broken. And then I heard that voice again. "Help me." I turned, and the faceless figures were there, circling the altar, their blank heads tilting in unison as they stared at me. I was trapped. I could feel their presence closing in, suffocating me, pulling me toward that stone altar, toward that twisted vision of my own corpse. Just as they reached out, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like icy fingers wrapping around my heart. I gasped, and everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying on the ground by the campsite, alone, with no sign of the altar, the figures, or my other self. The fog had lifted and the sun was shining through the trees as if nothing had happened. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and checked my body for injuries. I was fine, but there was a strange, lingering coldness that I couldn't shake. I made my way back to the station, not saying a word to anyone. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But every night since then, I've heard that voice, whispering from the shadows just beyond my door. Help me. I've tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Blackwater Pines has secrets, dark and terrible secrets, and it took a piece of me that night, a piece I'll never get back. I never used to believe in the supernatural, or whatever you want to call the things people say live in the woods, but after what happened at Hollow Pine last summer, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, my cousin Pete, and our buddy Tyler spending a few days off-grid, fishing and getting away from it all. Hollow Pine was miles away from the nearest town, a dense and tangled forest that sprawled over hills and cliffs. It was mostly untouched, isolated and wild, exactly what we were looking for. It felt like our little secret, a piece of nature we could call our own. Tyler knew the place well. He'd camped there with his dad growing up, so we trusted him to guide us to the best spots. The first 2 days went by in a blur of fishing, beer, and laughter. We found a clearing with a perfect view of the river, pitched our tents, and settled in. At night, we'd gather around the fire, telling ghost stories and jokes, the darkness beyond the flickering flames swallowing our laughter whole. On the third day, we decided to explore a bit further, to see if we could find a better fishing spot upstream. Tyler led the way, hacking at the underbrush with a machete while Pete and I followed close behind. We trekked deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing until it was almost non-existent, just a thin line of trampled weeds and roots. That's when we found the cabin. It seemed abandoned, old, its wooden planks blackened with age and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. We should have left it alone. We all knew that. But there was something magnetic about it, like the cabin was pulling us closer, urging us to look inside. Tyler, always the brave one, pushed the door open with a nudge of his boot. "Just want to take a quick peek," he said with a grin. We followed him in, our curiosity outweighing our better judgment. The cabin was bare, just a single room with a dusty wooden floor, a rusty old stove, and piles of rotting blankets in one corner. But it was the markings on the walls that caught our attention. Carved into the wood, in haphazard violent slashes, were strange symbols. Circles with lines through them, triangles interlocking, almost like a code or a language we couldn't read. They covered every inch of the walls, floor to ceiling. "What do you think they mean?" Pete asked, his voice low, reverent. "I don't know, man," Tyler replied. "Could be anything, maybe a hunter's lodge or some old trapper camp." But I wasn't so sure. The symbols seemed deliberate, ritualistic, like they had a purpose beyond decoration. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like the place was filled with a presence we couldn't see, but could almost feel. And that's when we heard it, a faint scratching noise like nails dragging across wood, coming from beneath the floorboards. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Pete nodded, his face pale, and Tyler crouched down, pressing his ear to the floor. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was trapped below us, clawing to get out. Without thinking, Tyler started prying at the boards with his machete, wedging it between the cracks and lifting them up. The smell hit us first, putrid, decaying, like rotting meat left in the sun. And then we saw it. A hole, carved out of the earth beneath the cabin, just large enough to fit a person. And inside, bones. dozens of them piled on top of one another, like someone, or something, had been collecting them for years. They weren't just animal bones either. There were human skulls, shattered and broken, ribs, femurs, all arranged in a twisted, chaotic pattern. "Let's get out of here," Pete said, his voice quivering. "Now." Tyler nodded and we bolted out of the cabin back into the woods. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, stumbling over roots and rocks. We didn't stop until we were back at our campsite, panting and out of breath. "What the hell was that?" I asked, but nobody had an answer. We all agreed to pack up and leave the next morning. Whatever we'd found in that cabin, it wasn't something we wanted to be near. That night we tried to sleep, but the forest was alive with noises, the distant rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, and something else. A low, guttural growling, moving in circles around our campsite. It sounded like an animal, but there was something wrong with it. It was too deep, too human, like a person trying to imitate a wolf's howl. And then the whispering began. It came from the trees from all directions at once, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, saying things we couldn't understand but felt in our bones. The symbols from the cabin flashed in my mind, over and over until they felt burned into my brain. "Do you hear that?" Pete hissed, and Tyler nodded, his face pale and sweat-slicked. We sat in the dark, knives clutched in our shaking hands, waiting for the dawn. Eventually the growling stopped and the whispering faded, leaving an eerie silence that stretched until the first light of morning. As soon as it was bright enough to see, we packed up camp, our eyes darting nervously at every sound, every shadow. We hit the trail fast, walking as quickly as we could, the woods pressing in on all sides. But after a couple of hours, it became clear we were lost. The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest, and the landscape around us seemed unfamiliar, like the woods had shifted overnight. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, spinning in circles, searching for any sign of the path. That's when we saw him. A figure standing just a few yards away, half concealed by the trees. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, gaunt, wearing ragged clothing that hung off his bony frame. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold, milky white, like they'd been drained of life, staring right at us without blinking. "Hey!" Tyler called out, waving his hand. "You okay, man? We're lost. Can you help us?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, and that's when I saw the symbols carved into his skin. They were the same symbols from the cabin, etched deep into his flesh, crisscrossing his face, his arms, his chest. His mouth hung open, slack, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat, the same growl we'd heard last night. "Run," Pete whispered, and we did. We ran like hell, crashing through the underbrush, pushing deeper into the forest without any idea of where we were going. The man followed, moving faster than seemed possible, his long limbs snapping as he chased us, the growl growing louder and more distorted, like a predator closing in on its prey. I don't remember how long we ran, hours maybe. But eventually we broke through the trees and stumbled out onto a dirt road where an old ranger's truck was parked. We banged on the doors, screaming for help until the ranger, a middle-aged woman with a concerned look, jumped out and asked us what was wrong. We babbled out our story, but she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she just shook her head and said, "You boys were in Hollow Pine, weren't you? Should have known better. That place, well, it's not like the rest of the forest." She drove us back to town, and we never looked back. But here's the part that haunts me. 2 weeks later, Tyler went missing. I got a call from his mom saying he'd vanished without a trace, no note, no signs of struggle. The last place anyone saw him was at a bar, telling some guys about our trip to Hollow Pine. And just yesterday, when I was out on a hike to clear my mind, I found something tucked into the fork of a tree by the trail, a piece of old, faded paper with a symbol carved into it. One of the same symbols from the cabin. Now every time I close my eyes, I see those markings, burned into the backs of my eyelids. And I hear that growling, echoing in the distance, coming closer and closer each night. I don't know if Tyler's still out there, but sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I hear whispers coming from outside my window, and I know I'll never go back to Hollow Pine again, at least not on my own. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters, and all that otherworldly stuff were just stories people told around campfires, right? That's what I thought. Until that night in Clearwater Forest. Me, Sam, Rachel, and Ben had been hiking through the woods for 2 days, exploring trails that only the most experienced hikers dared venture onto. The forest was huge, dense, and old, with a feeling like it had never been touched by human hands. Just endless trees and silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears after a while, making you feel like something's wrong. We found a great spot to camp on the second night, near a small creek that flowed between the towering pines. The sun was setting, and we were ready to sit around the fire, roast marshmallows, and trade stories. That's when Sam first mentioned the Mirror Man. "There's a legend about this forest," Sam said, his face half lit by the flickering flames. "About a man who lives deep in the woods. He's not quite human. Or at least, not anymore." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Come on, Sam. Save the campfire ghost stories for the kids." Ben laughed, but I could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "So what's the deal? This guy just lives out here? Why Mirror Man?" Sam leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The story goes that if you're alone in these woods after dark and you look into a reflective surface, water, a mirror, anything, he shows up. He looks just like you, at first. But then you notice something's off. His smile is too wide, his eyes too dark. And once you see him, he starts following you. First in your reflection, then in the real world." "Sounds like a dumb urban legend," I said, tossing a stick into the fire. "Let's not scare ourselves when we've still got a couple more days out here." Sam shrugged, smirking. "Hey, don't believe me, but they say if you break eye contact with the Mirror Man, he gets closer. If you ignore him long enough, well, you don't come back out of the forest." There was a heavy silence after that. I don't know why, but the idea of it stuck with me. Maybe it was how seriously Sam had told the story, or maybe it was just the growing sense of unease that had been creeping up on me since we entered the woods. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something crunching outside the tent. It was faint, barely noticeable over the soft breeze through the trees, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I listened, holding my breath. There it was again, a slow, deliberate footstep, like someone was walking around our camp. I sat up, glancing over at the others. Ben was snoring lightly, and Rachel and Sam were both fast asleep. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise, and slipped out of the tent. The night air was cold and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the campsite, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound except the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I turned toward the creek, something caught my eye, something in the water. A reflection. I moved closer, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The creek's surface was still, perfectly reflecting the moon and the trees. And there, standing on the opposite bank, was a figure. I froze. It was me, my reflection. But I wasn't standing on the other side of the creek. I was on this side. I lifted my hand slowly, and the figure in the water did the same. But there was something wrong with it. The movement was delayed, just by a second, like it was copying me but not quite in sync. And then it smiled. Not a normal smile. No, this smile stretched too wide, pulling the skin tight across its face, revealing too many teeth. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, but the reflection stayed there, grinning up at me from the water. I turned, backing away from the creek, but something told me not to take my eyes off the reflection. Sam's story flooded back into my mind. Don't break eye contact. The figure in the water stepped forward, out of sync with me now, moving on its own. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream. I was frozen, staring at this thing that was wearing my face but wasn't me. Then it whispered, its voice soft and distant like it was carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have looked." I blinked. And the moment I did, the figure was gone. The water rippled as if something had just stepped out of it. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark forest, silent and suffocating. I rushed back to the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't wake the others. I didn't tell them what I saw. Who would believe me? It was probably just a nightmare, right? My mind playing tricks on me after Sam's stupid story. But the next morning, when we packed up and started hiking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt different. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the trees sent a jolt of fear through me. And then, around midday, I noticed something strange. Whenever we passed a pool of water, a shiny rock, or anything reflective, I saw it. My reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It moved before I did, its eyes too dark, its smile lingering just a little too long. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was just tired, just paranoid. But that night after we set up camp again, it got worse. I went to the creek to fill my water bottle, and there it was again, standing just on the edge of the water, looking up at me. The same twisted grin, the same hollow eyes. Only now, it wasn't just in the water. It was on the surface, stepping out, as if it were climbing out of a mirror. I ran back to camp, my mind racing. Sam's story was just that, a story. It couldn't be real, but deep down, I knew it was. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing it out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of my water bottle, in the shine of my phone screen, always watching, always smiling. The next morning I tried to tell the others, but they just laughed it off. Sam said I was taking his story too seriously, and Rachel teased me about letting the mirror man get in my head. Even Ben told me to lighten up, but I could see it. I could see it watching us in every reflection, always a little closer than before. That night was the worst. We were sitting around the fire talking and laughing when I saw it. In the reflection of Ben's glasses just over his shoulder, my face but twisted, grinning, standing right behind him. I jumped up screaming, but by the time they turned around, it was gone. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." They didn't argue after that. The fear in my voice must have convinced them, or maybe they'd felt it too, the growing sense of dread in the woods. We packed up in a hurry and started hiking out, even though it was late and dark. But no matter how fast we walked, I could feel it following us, watching from the reflections in the trees, in the puddles, in our gear. Closer, always closer. We never made it back to the car. The last thing I remember is turning around and seeing them, the twisted, grinning faces of my friends. Only they weren't my friends anymore. They were reflections, hollow and wrong, stepping out of the shadows with those horrible, stretched smiles. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I don't know how long it's been since then. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work right here. The trees never end. The sun never fully rises, and I can't escape. Sometimes I see myself in the reflections, grinning, waiting. Sometimes I hear my friends' voices calling from the trees. But I know it's not them, it's him, the mirror man, and he's never going to let me leave. I never wanted to go on the trip. My buddy Jason practically dragged me out there. "Dude, it'll be fun," he'd said. "Just a weekend in the mountains, a few beers, a couple of trails. We need this." And I'll admit, maybe I did need to get away from the grind, from the same four walls and flickering screen every day. But when we reached the Blackwater Ridge Trail, and I saw how thick the trees were, how they choked out the sun like fingers reaching from below, my instincts screamed at me to turn around. I should have listened. The first day went like any other camping trip. Long hike, bad jokes, a lot of swearing while setting up the tent. But the trail was rugged, more overgrown than I expected. Half the time we couldn't even find the markers, so we just pushed through the brush, hoping we were heading the right way. By dusk, we finally set up camp on a small, flat clearing, but everything around us felt off. The woods were silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but a dead, muffled quiet that pressed in on all sides. No chirping birds, no rustling critters. Just the stillness of the trees standing like soldiers around us. We both felt it, though neither of us said anything. We just sat there, passing around a flask of whiskey to warm up as the cold mountain air set in. I don't know why, but that night we kept the fire burning bigger than normal, like we needed it to ward off the dark. Around midnight we heard a noise, a low, rhythmic knocking. Not like woodpeckers, and not like any animal I'd ever heard. Just knock, knock, knock. A steady thumping in the distance. Jason figured it was just trees creaking in the wind, but there was no wind. Not even the barest of breezes. It was hard to sleep after that, but exhaustion eventually overtook us. I woke up a few times in the night, feeling like something was watching us from the tree line. But every time I sat up and peered into the darkness, there was nothing, just black, endless black. The next day we went further up the trail, hoping to reach the summit by dusk. But the deeper we went, the harder it was to tell if we were still on the path. The trail markers were sporadic, the way ahead tangled with thorny vines and dense underbrush. At one point, Jason found what he swore was an old marker, a wooden post, carved with strange symbols, faded from age. But the more I looked at it, the less it looked like a trail marker and more like something else, something ritualistic. By the time we set up camp that night, I was on edge. Jason was more relaxed, cooking up some sausages over the fire, joking about how we'd probably get lost and have to live off the land. But as the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then I saw it, movement just outside the light of the fire. A figure, tall and gaunt, just barely visible in the shadows. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jason, my voice trembling. He followed my gaze but saw nothing. "It's your nerves, man. You're freaking yourself out." But I knew what I saw. Someone, or something, was watching us. The knocking started again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. The same steady rhythm, but closer. Jason, trying to lighten the mood, yelled into the woods, "Hey, if you're gonna join us, at least bring some marshmallows." But his voice seemed to die in the silence, swallowed up by the trees. We both fell quiet after that, just listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Then we heard it. Not a knock this time, but a voice calling from the darkness, soft and plaintive, like a child lost in the woods. "Help, please, help me." The words hung in the air, dripping with fear. Jason and I exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his bravado gone. "Yeah," I replied, barely able to get the word out. "But it's gotta be a trick or something, right?" Jason grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "What if it's real? What if someone's actually hurt out there?" He shone the beam into the trees, the light cutting through the black, but revealing nothing. "Hey," he shouted. "Where are you?" The voice called back, "Please, I'm lost. Come find me." Against my better judgment, we grabbed our gear and followed the voice. We had to at least see if someone needed help, right? It was human nature. But the further we went from the fire, the harder it became to find our way. The voice led us deeper, always just out of sight. And the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees crowding together, the air thick and stifling. And then the flashlight flickered out. Jason cursed, banging it against his hand to get it working again. For a split second, we were in total darkness, and that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Cold, clammy fingers digging into my skin. I spun around, but no one was there. "Jason, did you just touch me?" I hissed. "No, I'm right here," he said, but his voice was shaky. What the hell was that? When the flashlight came back on, we found ourselves surrounded by trees, but something was wrong. They were marked, carved with the same strange symbols from the wooden post. All around us, dozens of trees, each one with deep, jagged carvings spiraling up their trunks. It was like we'd stumbled into some ancient ritual site, forgotten by time. "Let's get back to camp," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We turned to go back, but no matter which way we went, it felt like the trees were changing, shifting. The path we'd taken moments ago was gone, swallowed up by the forest. And that's when we heard the voice again. But this time, it was different. "Help me," it whimpered. "I'm so hungry." And then it laughed. A high-pitched, cackling laugh that echoed through the trees, bouncing from one trunk to another, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. Jason started running, and I followed, desperate to get back to the camp, back to the fire. We ran for what felt like hours, until we finally broke through the trees and into the clearing. But something was wrong. The campsite. It looked abandoned. Our gear was scattered, the fire nothing but smoldering ashes, and our tent lay in tatters like something had clawed its way through the fabric. And then, in the middle of the clearing, we saw it. A figure crouched over the dying fire, its back to us, its limbs too long, too thin, and it was wearing Jason's jacket. "Hey!" Jason yelled, and the thing turned around slowly, too slowly, its neck twisting at an unnatural angle. And that's when we saw its face. It was Jason's face, pale, distorted, like a mask stretched too tightly over a skull. The eyes were all wrong, black and empty, staring at us with a hunger that made my stomach turn. And it smiled. A wide, gaping grin that split the face from ear to ear. Then it spoke, in Jason's voice, but wrong, garbled, like it was learning how to use the words. "Help me. I'm lost. Come find me." Jason screamed and bolted, and I followed, sprinting blindly through the forest, running until my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air. I don't remember how we made it out of those woods, but we did, collapsing into Jason's truck and peeling out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. The park rangers never found our campsite. They said we must have gotten turned around, ended up somewhere off the official trails. The Blackwater Ridge is a dangerous place, they warned. People go missing there all the time. But we knew what we'd seen, and sometimes late at night I hear it. That voice, whispering just outside my window. "Help me. Please. I'm lost." And I know it's still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, waiting. We'd been planning the trip for months, a weekend getaway deep in the woods, far from the crowds and the noise of our regular lives. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Emma, and our friends Jason, Lily, and Tom. The goal was simple: hike in, set up camp, drink some beers, tell stories, and disconnect from the world. We found the perfect spot, an isolated clearing near an old, overgrown trail. It was beautiful and untouched, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the sky. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Everything was perfect. That first day was normal. We spent the evening setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and cooking over the campfire. As the sun set, the woods transformed. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the temperature dropped quickly. Still, the fire was warm, and the laughter between us was enough to stave off the chill. Around midnight, after a few beers and stories, Tom leaned forward, his face half illuminated by the fire's glow. "You guys heard about this place, right?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Here we go, another one of Tom's local legends." But Tom's expression didn't break. "No, seriously. This forest used to be part of some old logging town back in the early 1900s. The town's long gone now, but people say weird things happen around here. People have disappeared, they never found bodies, just gone." Emma rolled her eyes. Every forest has a people disappearing story. Tom shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. Maybe, but they say something still walks in these woods. Something that can make you forget. There was a moment of silence before Lily burst out laughing. I'm sorry, Tom, but that's ridiculous. The conversation moved on, but the eerie tone lingered. Eventually, one by one, we all turned in for the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the soft crackle of dying flames. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Sometime during the night I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe a sound or a change in the air. But something felt wrong. The tent was stuffy, and the darkness felt thick, oppressive. Emma was asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I listened. The crickets were gone. The forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. I held mine too, straining to hear anything at all. Then, faintly, a whisper, soft, barely audible, like wind through leaves. But it wasn't the wind. I could hear words, though I couldn't make them out. They were wrong, distorted somehow. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was out, nothing but cold ashes and smoke. The trees loomed like shadows against the night sky. And there, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw something, a figure. At first I thought it was one of the others, maybe Tom or Jason, but this figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, at the edge of the darkness, as if waiting for something. My heart thudded in my chest, and I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The figure didn't move, but I had the growing, horrible sensation that it was staring right at me. I whispered Emma's name, but she didn't wake up. I whispered louder, shaking her shoulder. Still nothing. I glanced back at the figure. It was gone. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears. I scanned the edge of the clearing, but it was empty. The whispering had stopped too. The silence was deafening. Telling myself it had just been a trick of the light, I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion overtook me. The next morning I didn't mention what I'd seen. Maybe it was a dream. That's what I told myself. But Tom was acting strange. He was usually the first one up, eager to make breakfast or start packing for the day. But this morning he sat by the dead fire, staring at the ashes, barely acknowledging anyone. "Hey, you all right?" Jason asked, slapping Tom on the back. Tom blinked as if he hadn't heard the question. He muttered something about a rough night and shook it off, but I could tell something had rattled him. The hike that day felt off. The woods were darker than they had been before, even though the sun was out. The trees felt too close, the air too still, and every so often I thought I caught glimpses of something moving just out of sight, flitting between the trunks, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, we came across something that stopped us all cold. A cabin. It shouldn't have been there. There were no markings on the map, no trails leading to it. The wood was rotting. The roof partially collapsed, but it was unmistakable. A relic from the logging town Tom had mentioned the night before. No one spoke. We just stared. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "We should check it out." "No way," Emma said immediately, shaking her head. "This place gives me the creeps." But Tom was already walking toward it, his face set in that stubborn way of his. Jason and Lily followed, reluctant but curious. Emma and I exchanged a glance before we trailed behind them. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned cabin. Dust, broken furniture, and the stench of mold. But there was something else, too. A feeling. Like the air was heavier, thicker, as if we had walked into something ancient. Something that didn't want us there. Tom stepped inside first, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The rest of us stayed near the entrance, watching him carefully. He turned toward a wall where something was scratched into the wood. I saw his eyes narrow, trying to make sense of it. "What is it?" Jason asked, stepping closer. Tom didn't answer. He just kept staring, his mouth slightly open, his eyes unfocused. I moved closer, squinting at the marks. They weren't random scratches. They were words, carved deep into the wood in jagged, uneven lines. I read them aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "Do not forget." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Do not forget. What did that mean? And then, as if on cue, Tom slowly turned toward us, his face pale and blank. His lips moved, and when he spoke, it was barely audible. "I don't remember." My blood ran cold. "What?" Tom blinked, his face twisting in confusion. "Where are we?" "Tom, we're camping, man," Jason said, his voice rising in concern. But Tom only looked more confused. He stepped back from the wall, his eyes darting around the cabin like he was seeing it for the first time. "I don't remember this place," he whispered. "How did we get here?" The air in the cabin felt suffocating now. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We need to go." As we hurried out, I glanced back at Tom. He was still standing there, staring at the scratched words, a lost expression on his face. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Tom didn't say a word. He just stared into the flames, a hollow look in his eyes. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had Tom forgotten? And more terrifyingly, what might we all forget before the weekend was over?